Hi, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well. This is the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour coming to you from Jojage, which has long been a meeting place of various First Nations, otherwise known as Montreal. And the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour is a critical look at Canada's role abroad weekly. I'm Eve Engler. And there's a number of developments this week. There's some kind of bigger issues that I want to get to. I think that are fairly interesting in terms of Canadian foreign policy and some of where we're going, which is happening quite rapidly, kind of stunningly rapidly. But first off, there was Jeremy Appel has a story based upon access to information where he gets the title is As Canadian Government Celebrated Assad's Overthrow in Syria, GAC officials cautioned about what comes next. Documents obtained through ATIP reveal officials' concerns about Tarar al-Sham's history as an al-Qaeda offshoot and significant skepticism of their rebranding efforts. And so basically, internally, publicly, they celebrated Assad's downfall. Internally, they expressed quite a bit of caution, including Omar al-Jarraba. I'm mispronounced his last name. Who's the former minister, transport minister. Now he was the special envoy on Syria. So obviously they know what we know, which is that there is they worried about sectarian violence, and which of course we saw a great deal of a couple weeks ago. And so yeah, they obviously know that the 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 new government in Syria is has lots of questionable characters, and it's extremist government. But at the same time, they know that the Washington and others wanted to oust Assad, and so they obviously downplay, in public at least, downplay the nature of HTS. Today's Journal de Montréal has this story, two stories. The one's titled McGill honore une riche chinoise. So McGill honors a wealthy Chinese woman, and it's basically about this event that was held in China not long ago, where the president of McGill went there, and they're basically framing it as this woman has ties to the government in China, and the government in China, of course, as everyone knows, is the worst thing in the world, and so they kind of frame it as a scandal like that. And then they had another story that was all about the relationship between McGill and China, and different research projects, and there's all been these efforts to make these controversial, saying there's Canadian researchers working with Chinese researchers, and those Chinese researchers are connected to universities that have ties to the Chinese military. All of that, I assume, in the narrow is true, but as if the McGill doesn't have lots of connections to the Canadian and U.S. military, as if MIT doesn't have lots of connections to the U.S. military, as if, right? So it starts from this premise that China is all bad, and so any connection to a Chinese researcher that may have connections to the Chinese military is a horrendous thing. So it's kind of make this. And now what I found kind of interesting about, and I kind of agree, I think the extent to which university presidents focus on wealthy donors is outrageous, right? So in that sense, I actually agree with the criticism of the Journal de Montréal. But someone like Sylvan Adams, who's the biggest donor to McGill, who's like has this, he calls himself a self-declared ambassador for Israel, and has a formal position with the World Jewish I think it's with the World Jewish Congress, and has these connections to the Israeli government. they would never frame that in that sort of like controversial kind of light. Also on the Chinese file, there was a piece in the National Post which I thought was quite kind of humorous in this demonization of China, and the headline is Diefenbaker faced foreign interference, and uh, and they recount the story in this Global National Post piece that Diefenbaker, the Americans interceded to undermine Diefenbaker, and then ultimately help get Lester Pearson elected prime minister in 1963. And that's true. Uh, but what then they somehow connect that to Chinese interference in Canada today, not the more obviously more related and flagrant, which is U.S. interference in Canada today, which has a lot more connection to what John F. Kennedy did in terms of undermining Diefenbaker because he wasn't happy with Diefenbaker for being a little bit reluctant with the Cuban Missile Crisis and a little bit reluctant with the Beaumark missiles. So basically, Kennedy worked to undercut Diefenbaker because he demonstrated he was subservient, but not completely subservient. But the National Post is able to connect that to China today. The issue of I'm doing a piece on basically those who oppose or those who are worried about Trump's threats to Canada that Trump may invade, and I'll get to this in a second. That they should be calling for Canada out of NATO, and the one of the things that Kennedy did to undercut Diefenbaker was he sent the outgoing commander of NATO to Canada just before he stepped down to basically bemoan the fact that Diefenbaker wasn't accepting the Beaumark missiles and got Pearson to immediately say that to change his position and say he would accept the Beaumark missiles. And that was part of this sort of weakening, undermining of Diefenbaker, which led to the collapse of his government, and election that he lost. And so it's actually quite, I think, relevant to today because the whole question of NATO and NATO defending Canada that's floating around out there is I'll get to this in more detail, but there's this whole kind of people who are abandoning Trump, abandoning the U.S., militarists abandoning the U.S., but they're still pro-NATO. And they're implying that NATO in some way would defend Canada from a U.S. Invasion. And that's absolutely fanciful thinking, right? Latvia is not going to be sending troops to help if the US invaded Canada. Estonia is not doing that. Even France and the UK are not doing that. So there's this whole thing going on. Anyways, that history is relevant, but I'll get to that in more detail in a second. So the head of the teachers' pension fund said that defense poised to win under Trump. So the huge investment arm of in Ontario, they're talking up the military sector, and we're seeing more and more of this, the military sector growing, and stories about the arms industry. On the military front, there was a story, long interview in the Line publication, which I don't know much about. Seems like a pretty establishment outlet. I haven't checked it out much, but I'm reading this piece by one of the commanders of I forget what branch of the military he was commander of, but what he points out, he says we've got Murray Brewster now embedded in Operation Reassurance in Latvia. We've got Susan Ormiston. You might have seen her reports from HMCS Margaret Brooke. So we're really working to get the message out about what we do on operations, and by extension to raise interest and get people paying attention to the threats that are out there. Murray Brewster, of course, is the CBC's main military chief correspondent, and Susan Ormiston is I don't know where she works for, but she's a prominent journalist. So here you have the military official referring to it, them being embedded and basically them using the military, bringing the military on board to get their message out about the dangers in this world, which of course is about justifying military budget, which is justifying Canadian military operations, etc. The Poland and the Baltic states left the landmine treaty, land ban treaty this week, and the Globe quotes, I should say, the landmine ban treaty. Um, the Globe quotes Axworthy, the former foreign affairs minister who was central to negotiating that, quotes him saying that if Latvia, which is one of the countries that pulled out, where there's almost 1,000, 750, 800, steadily growing number of Canadian troops stationed, that if Latvia starts employing landmines, that Canadian troops would be potentially violating the treaty by working with them. So that's going to be interesting. The Globe has a one-off piece, but I didn't see any sort of follow-up on that. And of course, we know that Trump delivered a whole bunch of landmines to Ukraine. I think it was back in the summer last year, and that sort of began this process of legitimating. And this is the first time countries have pulled out of the landmine treaty, and it's almost the vast majority of the world's countries. There's like 174, I believe, that are part of it. So this is a fairly significant development, and it's a big development that it's a country where Canada is, has had troops stationed for 8 years now. The Liberals, Carney, this week announced that, or went up north and announced this $6 billion Australian radar for NORAD in terms of so-called modernization of NORAD. This was money that was already budgeted, but it was an announcement of the moving along of the project. And this whole NORAD and the idea that Canada is deepening, putting, I think the plan is $40 billion into upgrades in NORAD. This is all, I think, in the context of Donald Trump, this is all stuff that should become much, much more controversial. There should be much more calling of Canada to withdraw from these hundreds of bilateral military agreements or accords with the U.S. And but what we're seeing instead here is moving along with this upgrade. The F-35 issue that played out 10 days ago or something like that, 2 weeks ago maybe. The 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 government announcing that they were going to reevaluate the bulk of the 88 fighter jet purchase from Lockheed Martin. There's a military official or a former F-35 trainer, and I forget what his rank was. Flynn is his name. He's quoted saying, "Remember that every missile," basically contrasting why the F-35 and the U.S. control over the source code and the upgrades, how it's not much different than other equipment or weaponry. And he says, "Remember that every missile that we own and fire on the CF-18s and and all our frigates, all our offensive weapons are American, and necessarily the United States government has control over what's loaded into the latest version." So he's basically saying the F-35 is not much different than the rest of Canada's military equipment, which is mostly American and which the US has uh, uh, various levers at which they can control it, undermine upgrades, uh, software, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and so he's making that argument from the angle of, well, don't get too whipped up about the F-35s. But you can obviously flip that argument around and say, wow, we need to reevaluate all of our arms procurement and obviously by extension our whole relationship to the U.S. Military. And because of course they purchase this equipment in large part so they can be interoperable with U.S. military, right? And so that's why the Canadian military wants the U.S. Arms, and of course there's a whole corporate dimension to it. So, but that's all now being put under discussion. There's a quote in I'm not sure what publication it was in, but this American official who worked in the sector for Democrats and Republicans for many decades. He says, "You're not just buying an airplane; you're buying a relationship with the United States. People in the past have not just welcomed but craved that kind of relationship." In trying to explain why there's increasing questioning of the F-35 in Canada, Portugal, and elsewhere in Europe, NATO countries. So it's not just military equipment; it's part of a whole relationship to the U.S. It's a geopolitics and the like. And this week there was there's a push in Europe around obviously about rearmament. And there's a story in the CBC that says, as Europe rearms, Canada has what it needs. That can be the basis of a post-NATO alliance. So the story quotes this official saying that in the UK, Starmer is really pushing the military as a kind of military Keynesianism. Similar dynamic in Germany in terms of putting money into the military to jumpstart the economy and sort of justify there to be all these jobs. And they're saying it's all kind of connected to sending troops to Ukraine. And they're saying in this thing, they say that the military proposition that Starmer has on the table for just the UK's contribution to Ukraine peacekeeping force would cost the equivalent of 1% of GDP. So that's a huge amount of resources, and but it's being pushed as part of this whole, like I said, military Keynesian of just basically using military spending, ramping up military spending as a way to improve the economy, and saying that he's going around Britain selling this and bemoaning that there's no Canadian official doing the same thing. He says, if I were a politician, I would be saying every factory in Canada that's going out of business, we're going to figure out how we can make it part of the defense industrial complex and how we can provide for our European partners. So basically, Canada should, because Trump is not on board with Ukraine and or is doubting some elements of the Ukraine proxy war, and because he's unreliable ally, talking about annexing Canada, Greenland, that we should have this new relationship with the UK, France, Europe, a sort of NATO-ish kind of alliance, and this can be a real big boon to Canada's economy. Any businesses that get harmed in the trade war with the US, we're going to retool them to make weapons, and it's going to be all part of this huge increase in military spending in across Europe and of course implied here in Canada as well. And this is all, there's a lot to unpack in this, and I'm gonna Saturday's Globe was honestly, it was quite the opinion section was really kind of intense. They had three different stories that were kind of all just like the hyping up military, the threat from the US, all from these militarist people. So there's one is that Legace, who's the Norman Patterson School, this real, pro-US establishment military guy. He co-authored the piece, and it's wanted new allies. Successive Canadian governments have leveraged our close relationship with Washington to get the most out of our low defense spending. This long-standing approach cannot continue. Big long piece, like five, maybe even 10,000 words. And big part of it is about how the uh, the U.S. is no longer reliable. And there's an Ottawa Citizen op-ed by a military guy, kind of makes the same argument this week as well. But it's a big long piece, and but it's basically there's these militarists who have been pro-U.S. for a long time, and their world is collapsing, and it's collapsing rapidly. Okay, and so they're making this argument that uh, but they continue with their same demand. Okay, so before they were saying we need to increase military spending because the Americans want us to, and because NATO wants us to, and we got to increase military spending. Now they're saying the Americans are unreliable. We got to increase military spending because we were under the U.S. umbrella, and now we're not under the U.S. umbrella. So okay, still, but it's still same demand of increased military spending. Simultaneously, in the globe, there's two other pieces kind of related that are next to it on in its in section next to each other. Take a page. The two actually think take two full pages. Um, and so the other so they have Thomas Homer Dixon, who is it's kind of he's kind of basically like a meltdown piece where he the headline is if you want peace, prepare for war. Okay, if you want peace, prepare for war. And it says Trump wants to take our land, and the risk of that happening is higher if Canadians pretend it doesn't exist. Thomas Homer Dixon writes, and it's basically we need to rearm because the Americans may invade, and this total like kind of panic. Then they have another piece from a Royal Military College in Kingston. So that's the University of the Canadian Military. A prof there, and it's the headline is Canada needs to develop its own nuclear program. So we need to get nuclear weapons. Okay, so all these people, maybe Thomas Homer Dixon a little bit less, but even him, these would have all been like totally pro-US, pro-military people going back, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Now in the last like little bit, the again Trump's threats towards Canada and his uh, perceived abandonment of the NATO proxy war is these people are just completely collapsed. Their whole our alignment with the U.S. is now under question. Now, but they don't lead this doesn't lead them to a anti-imperialist position. This leads them to like a pro-NATO position. Like as if the US and NATO are different things. And okay, now I mentioned this a little bit, but they so yeah, they're doubling down with militarism. They're backing away from the US because it's become so clear. Like they're now everyone, it's like in the media now, everyone basically well, little Burkeson in the National Post, but basic unanimity that the F-35, we have to reevaluate the F-35. So that consensus happened in like 2 weeks, 3 weeks, just totally shifted on this idea of procuring from the U.S. But they can't back away from militarism in one way or another. They're paid to promote militarism, and they're clearly ideologues. They can't back away from imperialism and Canada as a dominating country, right? And when you think about like Mark Carney going to the UK and France, right? His two trips right after winning the Liberal leadership. Why doesn't he go to Mexico City? Why? That's quite fascinating when you think about it. It's based on this like Canada's part of this the imperial colonial club, and now we have like they've got a little bit of a problem with the U.S., but we're still part of that imperial club, and so we go to France and the UK, even though I don't know the numbers, but my guess is we trade more with Mexico, and we're obviously part of the trade agreement with Mexico, and it's closer. I mean, obviously, there's linguistic elements with France and the UK, and there's some historical elements there. But nonetheless, it speaks to these people are, they're committed to, Canada being this powerful force globally. So they want more military spending. They've now kind of retooled how they're framing the military spending. like I said at the start earlier on, now there's this underlying theme. There's a sort of pro-NATO element to a lot of this. Okay, a big part of their critique is that Trump's abandoning the NATO proxy war, and this it's not really stated per se, but it's totally implied that NATO is going to defend us. NATO's like, NATO will protect us. Again, I want to repeat this and make this absolutely clear. If the US invades Canada, we are not going to see Latvian troops coming to Canada's defense. Okay? Which then gets you the whole thing. And as far as I understand, there's only one time where Article 5 has been invoked, and that was after 9/11 in the US. So, of course, when Greece and Turkey were at war, I don't know exactly what happened there, but NATO sort of stayed out. Um, so I think that's there's some interesting elements there, but what we're seeing here is all part of this growing kind of consensus of military spending. NATO getting to 2%. I got sent a poll. I didn't actually read it. I got sent an article today about a poll claiming that three quarters of Canadians want the 2% now, is apparently what's going on. We, of course, the NDP came out in favor of that. That's wild, right? There's a star piece from the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives, and what he says that the 2% of GDP, the parliamentary budget officer, said Canada would need to increase to 87 billion between now and 2030. So 14.5 billion more every year to hit the 2% of GDP on the military. We're talking about huge, massive increases. This is what the NDP is committed to. This has now become the sort of consensus in the dominant, in politics and the media. And it's a wild amount of money. Now, kind of associated with this, Charlie Angus has this post that I saw today from I'm forgetting her name. She is a reverend. She was an NDP MPP in Toronto. I've written about her a couple times. She's very pro-Israel. She considers herself like a left-wing NDP MP, but she was quite pro-Israel. Um, uh, I'm forgetting her name now. Anyway, so she posts Charlie Angus saying this sort of meme he writes. Pete Navarro claims the U.S. will withdraw our borders. Not in a million years. Ukraine is the forward. Ukraine is the forward trench in the fight for democracy. Canada is the second line. If Ukraine falls, Navarro, Trump, and Putin will come for us. Canadians will never kiss the gangster ring. Okay, this is some like wild stuff. It's a real hodgepodge of nonsense, and this is sort of like Charlie Angus, the NDP MP, who's been kind of front and center on the challenging Trump kind of thing, and that's how it's framed in this post. I'm forgetting her name now, the former NDP MPP in Ontario, how she frames it about Charlie Angus's great struggle against Trump. But the idea that what happens in Ukraine is like step one towards the invasion of Canada, and that there's going to be like a Trump, Putin, Navarro invasion of Canada after they slice up the Ukraine, as he's framing it. This is real, like fanciful stuff. It only makes any possible sense is if you've completely bought the simplistic understanding of what's happened in Ukraine, i.e., the all horrible Russians just invaded, and the all humanistic NATO came to the poor Ukrainian defense, right? That's the only way this could make any sense. It still doesn't really make sense, even if you believe that, to then say that once there's an agreement on Ukraine, then Putin and Trump are gonna, I don't know, figure something out on Canada. That doesn't really make sense. But this is the kind of climate that is floating around out there. And what I find a little bit fascinating about some of the stuff, and even in some conversation with people far to the left of this, is there's a lot of fear about Trump, but people's reaction to it is quite military oriented. There's a sense that we need to have the military capacity to respond to a possible U.S. invasion, and uh, and I guess the first answer to that would be, well, you would structure the Canadian military completely differently if that was actually your aim. I think you would organize it much more as a sort of guerrilla resistance, and you would have more of the population that was involved in military training. You might even have a draft, and you'd probably buy much less high-end equipment. You wouldn't be buying the fighter jets and the stuff. You would be buying, some of the stuff Ukraine's been using, like the kind of mid-range drones, have lots of capacities in that front and stuff like that. Where you and your strategy. I'm not a military strategist, so there'd be obviously people who know this stuff way better than me. But you try to organize some degree of a sense of creating a cost for any possible invasion. But mostly that's all like a little bit. I think the possibility of a U.S. invasion is exceedingly low at this point, and mostly what we should do is just reduce military spending. And that's really the sovereign. Trump's pushing for us to increase military spending. The sovereign decision is to really go in the opposite direction. But the main way you, of course, oppose an invasion is by speaking to the U.S. public and global public that Canada's not a militarist, not a violent, not a hostile, not a whatever country, and that this doesn't make any sense on legal, moral, and other kind of grounds. And a country like Mexico spends about half of the proportion of its GDP on the military as Canada. Spends substantially half as much in actual dollars as Canada. So it's right on the border. It's in the same kind of potential position of a U.S. Intervention. And I think that there's something to be said. I think it needs to be explored more. And I don't have my kind of head fully wrapped around it. But the scope to which militarist thinking shapes like how we respond to Donald Trump and the idea we're going to get nuclear weapon. That's a horrible idea on all kinds of level. It's a horrible idea at the level of we don't want more nuclear weapons in the world. It's a horrible idea at the level that it probably would actually, rather than, it would probably precipitate or could precipitate. I think Washington, Trump would consider that seriously hostile. So it's not, but it's sticking to this militarist kind of thinking that is I think really widespread, and partly it's tied to the fact that Canada, it's like our whole ethos is that we're part of the dominating countries, right? We're part of those who dominate the world, and I think that, like, most of the world's countries don't have fighter jets. Many don't even have militaries, and they don't have any conception. They understand that they could be militarily dominated, right? The Americans could invade, and there's not much they could do about that, and there's not really any scenario where they could do that much to change that. Anyway, so that's I think something that needs to be fleshed out a bit. But the important point in seeing the Globe and Mail and other media is like this we have gone in a really short period of time where the establishment voices are now like basically, whoa, our military is way too tied to the US. Our procurement is way too tied to the US. And there's opportunities there to just bust up, to undermine, to weaken this whole relationship that's gone on for decades and decades. That is a very bad thing of Canada assisting the U.S. military machine in its global domination. And we need to push on that more. This week we had the CFPI put out a action alert with JPA on the officer exchanges between Canadian and U.S. military, and there's some more of those similar type things that we're planning coming forward. Shifting gears to Palestine, a few developments. There's a story in the Narwhal about the flow through shares charity, and so I think I mentioned this last week or week before. The Canadian Jewish News had a story, had an advertisement for tax office or accountant, where they're saying that if you want to donate to charities, we can get 90% of that written off for your taxes. 90%. So if you're one of these Israel charities, we've discussed this many times, of course, dealing with different, assisting the Israeli military in some cases, West Bank settlements, that you can get 90% of that money back uh, in tax receipts. And so the Narwhal has this piece today. Oh, it was sent to me today. I don't know when it published today. I think it was published today. That says that so the headline is wealthy Canadians use a charitable tax loophole to fund mining companies. And it's this flow through shares, which I don't still fully, even after reading the story, I don't fully understand. But it's this incentivizing purchasing um, exploration mining companies. So it's a way for the government to basically have capitalists, have so-called investors put up money for exploration mining companies because they often fail. They mostly fail. They generally fail, and and so you don't get like a return. And it's a whole way of incentivizing that. And so that's why they've created this flow through shares. That shouldn't exist. And that's the angle that the Narwhal is taking, the environmental angle, and how it's very anti-indigenous because it's basically stimulating these mining companies to explore in Canada in areas reserves of and all kinds of ecological, all kinds of all the issues that come with mining and the extraction process and the trampling on indigenous rights, etc. And they're basically focusing on how these charities are all gotten completely complicit in this, and now these charities are actually promoting this as a model of giving, and like the Saputo family, the billionaire family here in Montreal that runs the cheese billionaires. They just gave $5 million to University of Ottawa, and it was all through these flow through shares. In the story, they claim that there's actually instances where it gets above the amount. So if you were giving $5 million, you could actually get a tax credit above 5 million. There's some rare situation, but mostly it's they say 99% sometimes, and different criteria. So they're saying that basically when you use your donation, you get 50. If you were just giving cash, you get 50%. And if you're giving through this, now why this is important from the Israel standpoint, first of all, the story points out that they list the top 10 recipients of these flow through charity recipients of these flow through shares, and the Jewish Federation of Toronto and Montreal are both. I think they were 3 and 4 or 4 and 5. They were both on the top 10 list, towards the top of it. And um, so the subsidy that's going to these projects in Israel is 90%. Often is 90%. It's crazy. Like the public is paying for VAT, almost all of it, right? And that just makes it just a whole other layer of scandal. It's already scandalous, even if it was 50%, even if it was 30%. But I mean, it's scandalous they're even doing this in lots of cases. That even if there wasn't a tax receipt, it would be scandalous to that Heather Reisman and Jerry Schwartz were, setting up the Hesek Foundation for non-Israelis to join the Israeli military. But if it's getting 90% 90% subsidized, I mean, that's just a whole other layer of scandal. So that's kind of interesting. Definitely needs a whole bunch more research and a whole bunch more kind of figuring out like how widespread this is in these pro-Israel charities, and it's all structured for the wealthiest, right? It's the people making over 500,000, according to the story. That's where these flow through shares and this model is particularly lucrative. Um, there was another one of those real estate fairs at the Thornhill Synagogue, um, trying to sell Palestinian property. I think it was on Thursday. The director of CIJA in Israel, that I think is David Weinberg's his name, um, is calling has a piece calling for Trump and Netanyahu to go to war with Iran and calling on, in his words, quote, eviscerate Tehran. So the fanatics that are in charge of the the major Israel lobby group. This guy Kevin Haas, who was charged with brandishing a knife at a protest in Vaughan, pro-Israel guy, um, against when there was protests against the settlement, the real estate thing previously. Uh, 20 years ago, he was convicted on hate crimes against Arabs and Muslims. So Samira Moidin went back and found a Globe and Mail story about his conviction 20 years ago. In Toronto, there's a big push. There's a poll the city is trying to shut down what they call protests in front of vulnerable institutions. And there's a online poll asking people's attitudes on that. Anyone from Toronto should engage in this and say that this is completely ridiculous and odious. They would, it's wild. They would ban protests in more than 1,000 different institutions in Toronto, um, including the Nathan Phillips Square, where there's been kind of major regular protest place, and because there's a daycare inside, and one of the protected institutions is our daycares, and so they theoretically could be banning protests in front of City Hall because there's a daycare at City Hall. So this is just, and this is it's totally, there's as a number of people pointed out this week, in 2009, I believe it was there was big protests within the Tamil community. They took over the big highway, the Gardner. They all kinds of disruptive protests. More recently, there was tons of protests with the Iranian community. None of this business about bubble zones. It's another example of the Palestine-Israel exception, the attack against freedom of expression on this issue is on a whole other level. Belleville, the library, reneged on hosting an event discussing doctors in Gaza. More examples of that suppression of opposition to genocide. The National Post has this piece this week, and Canada on path towards censorship, illiberalism. Okay, and why I point this out is, but like, could you imagine in at this point writing a piece about like censorship in Canada and danger of illiberalism, and Israel and is just completely wiped out? I mean, these people are living in like a completely different world where the attacks against freedom of expression or the right to protest is it's the trans community and stuff like that. That's what they're trying to frame. In the real world, we're seeing an obvious and aggressive effort by Zionists to undercut civil liberties, to undercut basic rights that are in the charter. Um, but if you read the National Post, that's of course all a good thing. There's a Pivot has a story about the Fédération Professionnelle des Journalistes du Québec, so the Journalist Association Quebec, and they're refusing to denounce Israel's attacks against press freedom. Just today, another journalist was killed, prominent journalist, and he wrote, young guy, Israel killed, and amongst all these killings that we're seeing here now, I think it's 66 today. It's probably about 1,000 now over the past week. This young guy, he wrote a like clearly fairly recently wrote like a statement, if upon my death kind of statement, and it's just so sad and just so horrible to see just this impunity. They just kill journalists endlessly, and the professional association, the Canadian Association of Journalists, doesn't say anything. Just can't, they just keep quiet on it all. It's just level of deference to authority and to power and fear is just off the charts. Um, I guess moving forward. Couple on the positive note, UBC, there's a big referendum, and they voted to strike for divestment. At the UBC Okanagan, the students started a hunger strike to demand divestment. There's a lawsuit that was defamation lawsuit by a Montreal City Councillor, Alex Norris. He's suing Jeremy Levy, the mayor of Hampstead, asking for, I think it's 100,000 in damages because Levy called him an anti-Semite because he liked a Quebec Solidaire post uh, promoting a demonstration against Israel's genocide. So he's suing them. I'm curious to see what comes out of that. Also, Burju Datani, he was the appointed for the position of the Canadian Human Rights. I don't know, it's not called Human Rights Council, Human Rights. Anyways, Canadian Human Rights Body, and he's sued B'nai B'rith. He's a defamation suit, and Dahlia Kurtz. He's suing Dahlia Kurtz for calling him a anti-Semite, and he actually showed up at my event in Toronto on Saturday, and Kurtz has I think it's 20 days to respond. They called him a terrorist supporter or something like that, and uh, and so there we'll see what happens in this, but he was pretty. I talked to him a bit after. He was pretty keen on this. That they would be very difficult for them to offer any evidence of what they've the slander they've leveled against him. So it's good to see there's some offensive that these genocidal individuals and organizations, these pro-violence racist individuals and organizations, that there's a pushback in a legal area because of course the Zionists have principally been the ones using the legal system to target those opposing genocide. I'll leave it at that. And if anyone has comments or questions, go ahead and I'll try to make Laura a co-host. I think I made you co-host, Laura. I can't see anybody.
Okay. Lynn, can you unmute, please?
Well, obviously, the more that you're increasing munitions, the more you intend to use them, and it's interesting the dynamic because it's like in Ukraine, it's like, is Russia going to run the world, or over on this continent, is the United States going to run the world? And um, I say, hey, is Russia and the United States going to buff it out, because that's where the real um, threat to humanity is. And, other smaller countries getting joined in, like with NATO or with other unions against, bigger countries, it's kind of come to a head with Trump because he's the biggest, hugest idiot that has ever run the free world. And it's like, is that going to bring the rest of the planet together to get rid of him? Because, I don't know what you feel about time, Eves, but I feel like, hey, You know, you're alive one minute, you're dead the next. You don't know when that's going to happen. And I say seriously, with this kind of munitions buildup, it's just a matter of it doesn't happen to be me today, but only time is the distinction between me and when I'm not here anymore. So what are we going to do? I mean,
So that's your question for Eve? Okay, do you have a response to that?
Well, I mean, yeah, I don't, obviously, Trump is pursuing all kinds of odious policies, and um, the silver lining is a little bit of what you say, that in that he's such a crass um, individual that his functioning of the U.S. empire is not, I would say, the smartest, and he's exposing just how violent and colonial the inclinations of Washington are. But yeah, I mean, I don't know if we're in a situation where obviously the possibility of a war with Russia is there, but I don't think that. I think in fact that's the one area where I think Trump. I sort of agree with Trump, is I think he's actually trying to avoid that more than Biden was. But obviously, when we look at the Middle East, and he's even worse than the already horrible Biden. But yeah.
Okay, Hans, go ahead, please.
Well, I would like to thank you, Eve, for showing up in Toronto and livening up the place in the framework of potentially having to set up a defense committee if the charges against you in Montreal are not dropped. Uh, would you comment on the success of your appearance at Al Quds Day? That was yesterday. I thought the event had a bit of a religious flavor, but I think you injected a great deal of secular sobriety into it. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was a good event on Saturday night, and talked about some of the repression, and just, Canada's history of anti-Palestinian history and current, of course. And then the Al Quds Day was a pretty good turnout. I think I said 2,000 online, but the police, according to Toronto Star, the police said it was 3,000. I kind of got a little bit screwed up with timing, and I had anyways, long story about a ride share, but it was actually quite a stressful experience. But I was supposed to speak in front of the Toronto police station, kind of highlight repression. I had to ultimately do it at the main stage. But yeah, I mean, it's more, I agree with you. It's more religious. I don't come at this issue, of course, from any sort of religious angle. But yeah, it was a good demonstration, and yeah, it's I'm happy I went, because there's a lot of pushback, right? This whole effort to shut it down and all that. The counter demonstration ended up being pretty small. Um, so I think it was again a failure of the Zionist forces to obviously to shut it down, and even to have a sort of turnout to counter it. So that was I think also good. But yeah.
Okay, Yuri, go ahead, please.
Thanks, Laura. Well,
Your voice is pretty muted, Yuri. Can you turn your volume up?
oh, okay. How about now? All good?
Still pretty low.
How about right now?
Okay, that's good.
Oh, okay, that's strange. That's fun because I put my microphone in. Okay. Well, anyways, well, Eve, given all you've talked about with the people who are sort of being sort of pro NATO and are and all this stuff, and are don't you think that this actually proves my arguments that we should that Mike, that the Canadian left should not be responding to Trump with sort of left nationalism, because there's all these people who are sort of like saying that as, oh, NATO will be the one to save us, or Canada should be having nuclear weapons. And Chrystia Freeland was talking about how we need a Five Eyes alliance, but without the US in it. Talks about a European army. So that's basically okay. So you want NATO without the US, and you also have people who also are attacking Trump from the right. So they actually want Trump to escalate the Ukraine war and so forth because they want him to do good. There are still people who foolishly believe that America can be a force for good in the world as long as you kind of spin it with a liberal thing. So don't you think that, given all you've just said, that this proves that no, we need to speak truth to the power and to the powerless, and bring an unapologetically decolonized anti-imperialist perspective in response to Trump and any other douchebag president that comes after him.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's no, Charlie Angus is trying to make the NATO proxy war in Ukraine like Canadian nationalism. And that was a lot. I talked about that. I don't know about publicly, but I talked about it privately, different people, a lot after the, Russian invasion and that whole, like, I kind of was like, why are these sort of leftists acting like they're, I get if you're in Ukraine, I get the idea that you're at war and you have to like just sort of rally behind and fight off the invader. I get that idea. I don't really get that from 10,000 kilometers away. Why would you have to have that sort of ethos in Canada? And clearly, like, even a lot of people on the left kind of took up this, like, it's just we're at war and it was like it was our war and this kind of stuff. And so Charlie Angus is trying to do that very explicitly by like connecting it to, Trump's going to invade us, Trump and Putin are going to invade us right after. So that's like a making Canadian nationalist ideology the ideology of the U.S. empire, NATO, whatever you want to call that exactly. And so yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting. That's something that needs to be certainly challenged and critiqued and stuff. I don't know that. I mean, I agree with you in one sense, but I don't like. I think that we shouldn't underestimate how kind of radical what these people are doing is incoherent. They can say they can say that like we're gonna okay, Trump's gonna withdraw from NATO and we're gonna still be in NATO or some other NATO-ish group. It's not really. It's very incoherent, right?
Yeah.
Just like even if Canadian military procurement. Okay, you probably can't hit 2% of GDP by 2030, even if you were buying U.S. equipment. And you certainly can't hit it if you ain't buying U.S. equipment. So if they're starting to say we're not going to procure from the U.S. anymore, it like things like that don't even make sense. Okay, and if you say like the Canadian military is going to become an anti-U.S. military, can this military currently act like? Does that mean you have to just create a whole new military? I would say probably. So there's a lot of room to go with, let's call it genuine nationalism, particularly on military affairs, less so on other affairs, but particularly on military affairs, other elements of Canadian foreign policy specifically, and then of course Indigenous. That's a whole other question too. But so on military affairs, if you were to go really a radical nationalist line on the Canadian military, I mean, you're basically saying get rid of the Canadian military. You could be saying get rid of it and not have anything else, or you're saying get rid of it and create a whole different institution. So there's a lot of room. We're very, very far from that. So I get your point, and but so yeah. So that's part of what I would say to that. But I also agree with you in the sense that like, we shouldn't be we can play up like if you look at the action alert there on the halt military exchanges, right? There was a few people that emailed in response to Action Alert, saying, "Well, why are we saying just halt military exchanges so long as Trump is threatening to annex Canada? Why we should just be like halt military exchanges?" I, of course, agree with that position of halting military exchanges with the U.S. as just a, blanket, but it's, it's just tapping into something that's out there in the, right? Like, so it becomes just sort of strategic in the most kind of narrow sense of that. And yeah, I guess I agree with you that there is a danger in that kind of being strategic or playing off a certain kind of nationalist ethos that's floating around, and that can get, so I agree with you, and we should definitely be completely conscious of that. But also, it's, I don't think that it's a mistake to. I would say it is a mistake to be just so like, okay, we're just going to say our same position all the time and not make it relevant to what's actually happening politically, right? Like that, So you do have to take people where they're at to some extent, right? And that is part of I think, successful anti-imperialist, successful all politics, right? Is to figure out, and not now don't you don't concede too much to it, or you don't mythologize while doing it, or you try to whatever, right? But yeah, so
Just as a last question, Eve, I just wanted to ask you with the election now, the snap election for about, what is it, about a month now? Are the candidates all being asked a lot of questions about the red hot button issues on foreign policy? And if so, have you heard anything from Carney that, gives you hope, or the opposite?
yeah, I haven't. I mean, it's just started. Now, I'm actually meant to talk a bit about this during the I haven't seen much.
Mhm.
Yeah, but I think people we really need to be going out there and asking every single uh, candidate about the genocide. I think that's so
Mhm.
important
Yeah.
that people across the country, uh, simple thing that people can do, if you either go to a meeting, either if you have someone knock on your door, film yourself asking them a very simple question. Do you condemn, I don't know, the simple one being, do you condemn Israel's genocide in Gaza, right? And post it. And, both it's useful to bring it up to them, and it's also useful to then circulate it politically. Go to, and anyone who can, if anyone has any time or who's in Montreal, help me with trying to figure out getting the information on all the different candidates in Montreal. I'd like to go to as many events, as many of all, because I mean, there's dozens of ridings in the city, and I presumably there's gonna be tons of events, tons of little things. Just the offices, go to the offices. If a candidate has an office, in your riding, go to their office, and if you can't talk to the candidate, talk to a staffer. I mean, ask a question of the staffer on, particularly on, I think, Canada's complicity in genocide. That, to me,
Mhm.
we need to be circulating that widely. There is the Vote Palestine. People should sign that. But I think a really simple thing people can do is just, any candidate you see, whatever the political, ask that. Particularly the conservative and the liberal candidates. But yeah,
Yeah, it seems essential now. Chris Hedges just had a really heartbreaking article about saying, well, how this is the last chapter for Palestine. What's going on there just sounds like either agree to be deported or exterminate. Anyway, it's unbelievable.
it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. If we're going to go back to another 16 months of these, like every day, one day it's 66, next day it's 150, next day it's 200, I mean, and like the minimum is that all these people should be saying, I oppose, even if they don't do anything or do very little. At minimum, all these candidates running should be stating publicly that they oppose the genocide.
Well, yeah, and it's also the starvation and lack of water. So many people are writing about it, including famous people like the journalist Abu Bakr. He's talking about how he's malnourished. He's so tired, he can't work because of the lack of food. Anyway, it's unbelievable. Anyway, thanks, Eve. I think that's it.
Thanks, everyone. Have a
Thanks,
good
Eve.
night.
Bye.